Adversaries are relentless, and they're only getting smarter, faster, and more sophisticated. Knowing their game is the only way to beat them. That's why we're here. Learn what it takes to protect against even the most sophisticated attacks. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast.
Buenos dias.
Hey, buenos dias.
How's it going?
It is going muy fantástico.
With our LATAM report, we'll also be doing it in Portuguese. So,
Really?
bom dia.
Bom dia. You know, my Portuguese is abysmal.
Yeah,
it's not the greatest.
that's what Gen AI is for.
Oh, very good point. I usually, when I'm talking to someone, and they're like, oh, you know, hablas español? And I go like, sí, pero hablo más mejor cuando tengo una cerveza en mi manos, which basically means, like, I speak it a lot better when I have a beer in my hands. It's funny, like, if I'm in the environment, it comes out a lot more. Like, a couple of years ago, I was in Spain, and day 2 in Spain, I was just like, okay, this is it. Like, I'm just going into it, right? And then people would correct me. They would see that I'm trying, and they would correct me, and it just worked out. It comes out if I'm in it.
People appreciate you trying, though, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. So,
with that said, let's go into LATAM.
Yeah, LATAM. Welcome to the Adversary Universe podcast, by the way, folks. Thank you so much for listening again. We're expanding, and we have been expanding, and we have been covering adversaries across the globe. And this year is actually pretty interesting because this is our first ever LATAM focused report that we're publishing, right?
It is. I think this is a really cool kind of concept that we came up with because the team pulled together this amazing, we started kind of changing some of the report structure that we do within CrowdStrike Intelligence. And we were doing this monthly report, and the team kind of felt that was kind of superfluous. And so they suggested, Katie actually had suggested, can we move this over from a monthly report and we'll start doing some more regional focus? And we said, all right, let's give it a try. And the first one, which we're releasing publicly now, was so in depth and covered such a breadth of areas ranging from the very tip of South America all the way up to the Caribbean. And I said, what a great opportunity for us to put out a threat report to kind of a specific region. We're going to put a few more of these out throughout the year too. So stay tuned, smash that like button and hit subscribe. But we'll have a few more of these coming out throughout the year. But this one, I think, was just, so in depth that we had to release it publicly. And we're also, for the first time, putting out one of our reports in a different language. We're actually putting out in both Spanish and Portuguese.
Oh, I love this. Do we get a lot of those requests, for localizing, reporting, and focusing on, very specific geos? Does that typically come into your team?
What we do, and generally we don't do it because, particularly with different languages, the concept, a lot of the things don't translate one-to-one, and it can get a little bit weird. We've had problems. I remember years ago when we tried to localize some of our web content, and the German website was so off that, our Germans, there's a lot of Germans here at CrowdStrike as well. And they reached out to me and they're like, what is this?
They're like, this makes no sense.
Yeah. They're like,
this is horrible.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So I have a few questions. I know that this report is, again, very special. It's been something you've been working on some time. There's some trends that I know you're going to cover. Mm-hmm. Especially when it comes to the increase in cybercrime and then also nation state activity. I'd love to kind of unpeel also China's focus on different, countries in Latin America.
Yeah.
I think that could be even just like its own dedicated episode.
China's its own dedicated podcast, really.
Yeah, seriously. Yeah, I'll tell you what, actually, in fact, let's just dive into this, right? Like, what are some major highlights from this report that, just stand out in terms of the increase of crime?
Yeah, we saw, I think the first thing is, that broadly we're seeing that LATAM is becoming much more heavily targeted by traditional eCriminals. They also have their own criminal elements emerging within LATAM. So it's kind of a space that's growing both internally or domestically, if you will, and externally. Some of the top things that we saw was that, there was a 15% increase in Latin American organizations that were being extorted and ended up on these data leak sites. So ransomware and data extortion, these are things that are now becoming the norm in Latin America. And that 15% increase will just continue to grow, I think, as the threat actors see that some of these victims will pay and that they're susceptible, they're going to keep kind of trying to squeeze that.
It's very interesting. Are we seeing that, like, what's attracting this eCrime activity? Are we seeing companies actually make these payouts?
I think to your question about why are we seeing it down there, I think that threat actors, as they continue to go after different victims, they're going opportunistically. Mm-hmm. They're looking for large sources of credentials that they can use to gain access. Because remember, a lot of the eCrime space is driven by ransomware as a service threat actors. And so they're going to use this ransomware as a service. They just need to get in and deploy it. And one of the other things we know in this report was that we saw over 1 billion credentials leaked from Latin American organizations last year. So that gives them a lot of ammunition to start kind of trying to spray and pray and see where they can get access and go from there.
That's actually pretty interesting. I don't know how much collaboration is being done. I'm sure that out of this we'll probably see communities across these Latin American countries collaborating a little more on some of the tradecraft that they're observing.
What are you talking about from the cybersecurity perspective?
From a cybersecurity perspective.
Not from the bad guys.
Less from the bad guys, exactly.
Yeah,
More on the
also
side. Yeah, I'm sure they've been collaborating for a while, right? The bad guys have. But.
Yeah, we're starting to see, again, like nascent agreements being put in place by some of these countries. And, when you take a look, some of the top targeted countries that we call out in the report, you've got Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Peru, top kind of targets that we've seen. And the verticals are pretty consistent with what we see elsewhere. The number one target is technology, followed by financial services, followed by retail. And then we see ProServe and healthcare and things like that also being targeted. So kind of consistent with what we see globally, but, certainly a big concern. And then when we look at the leaked credentials, I mentioned those 1 billion leaked credentials that we picked up. Brazil, far and away, the biggest one that has leaked credentials, followed by Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, Venezuela, and Bolivia.
Who's responsible for these attacks? Like, do we have a cluster or several groups that are become a little more prevalent within Latin America? For
sure. The top ransomware is Ransom Hub. We covered that in a recent podcast. That's Oculus Spider moved over to Dragon Force. They've been having some problems lately. The Dragon Force infrastructure was down over the last week or so. And one of the issues has been that they're not just the data leak site, but also the portal by which the affiliates can communicate with the victims is down. And I think we just saw that the Dragon Force team demanded something like almost a $10,000 US cryptocurrency payment by the affiliates to demonstrate their loyalty to the platform.
Oh, wow.
Which, I don't...
Like a franchise fee, like a sign-up fee? Really?
No, just because they were out of service, and I think that they're doxed a few people that they didn't like that were using their platform. So seems like all is not well in the world of Oculus Spider.
Oh wow, that's fascinating. All right, who else is out there then?
I love that for them, by the way.
Oh, really? You know what? Yeah,
yeah. So Ransom Hub is the big one down there. Kira, Punk Spider is the other big one. We see Fog ransomware. We see Clop, Lockbit. So a lot of the big ransomware as a service players. But again, because they're ransomware as a service, they could be recruiting eCriminals from the region too, who understand the region, who understand the target space, and who understand how to operate down there. So there could be some growing affiliate infrastructure coming out of Latin America as well. And again, Brazil, number one top targeted country, followed again by Mexico and Argentina. So you're getting a consistent set of targeting.
Okay, that's interesting. I met with some companies from Latin America just this past week while we were at RSA, right? And the majority of the concerns for these companies was around also critical infrastructure within Latin America, that being targeted by adversaries, outages, a lot of this being driven by the concerns that we saw in Spain with that outage. Yeah. And so, eCrime actors, again, very opportunistic, as you mentioned. They're trying to monetize their access, monetize their efforts, their final objectives, get money some way from ransom or extortion campaigns. But from the infrastructure side, that's a little more nation state. Would you agree on that?
Well, I think not necessarily. Infrastructure can be accidentally taken down too, right? By eCriminal activity, and even by the victim who's trying to respond to the incident. There's not always a nation state tied to an infrastructure targeting. And also hacktivism, very prevalent in Latin America. Yeah. We see a lot of that, particularly around social issues and electoral issues. We see that, there was years ago, I think there was an anonymous related police officer that stole a helicopter and attacked the Supreme Court with grenades, if I remember correctly. There were pictures of him with the Guy Fawkes mask and everything. Yeah. So it is a different kind of threat landscape down there. And when we think about the prevalent threat actors, eCrime, I think, is probably the most significant thing down there. We mentioned Oculus Spider, also Brain Spider, pretty active down there. Bitwise Spider, which is Lockbit. Frozen Spider, which is the Medusa cryptor. Punk Spider, I mentioned as well, and Vice Spider. So we do see a lot of targeting across Latin America that is associated with these traditional ransomware as a service. As we get into the state nexus, though, they are trying to target governments and NGOs across the region. Groups like Vixen Panda hit more than a dozen LATAM countries. We see Liminal Panda targeting telcos and financial services down there. Yeah. Liminal Panda does some really interesting stuff. And we've talked about this with the Global Threat Report, how we're starting to see China become more specialized. Liminal Panda is an example of that. They've targeted financial services, but their bread and butter is in the mobile and telco space, where they've got really interesting tools like something called Sigtran, where they can kind of proxy TCP traffic up to the more of the telco protocols like within SS7 and M3U and stuff like that. So we're seeing that down there as well. Aquatic Panda, which is one that we've covered quite a bit, has focused on the government and the defense sector down there. And so we're seeing quite a bit of that. And then we also see North Korean adversaries down there who are using these fake employment scams to gain employment down there. So a lot of the problems we see elsewhere in the globe from nation state perspective are down in Latin America. We do know that the Chinese have been extremely active down there, both from a cyber perspective, but also with infrastructure projects, which gets to the broader strategic objectives of China, where they use debt diplomacy and things like the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to get these countries to recognize China versus Taiwan. So they've embedded themselves down there like a tick.
Yeah. Yeah, I know they were working. There's a huge the Megaport project in Peru, for example, right? They've been really getting their hands into a lot of infrastructure initiatives down there.
Yeah.
So now I'm very curious on like, what does that look like even from a cyber perspective, right? And if their hands are in everything, what type of visibility does it give them and data advantages does it give them in terms of understanding or even steering economic growth in different countries that they've been very heavily invested in. So I wonder how they weaponize that in the future. I'm very curious on your take on that.
Yeah, I don't want to overstate it, right?
It's
there is limited operations from China down there, but they are very strategic. So they have, from what we've seen, they're active, and there's probably going to be more of it. So to our listeners in Latin America, this is kind of the moment to get in front of that, because that will be a continuing and evolving problem.
You mentioned groups like Punk Spider. You mentioned groups like Ocular on the eCrime side. And then obviously activity coming out of China is increasing substantially. When it comes to like telcos and some of the more, even on the energy side, right? Energy sector industry, like, are we seeing also an increase in, because we published this in a report of initial access being tied to vulnerabilities, like 52% of the initial access or vulnerabilities that we saw were tied to initial access. And a lot of it was tied to old infrastructure or infrastructure that has been abandoned or orphaned or just not patched. Are we seeing those types of access numbers also in Latin America, with like older infrastructure that's out there?
Yeah, I mean, it's the same vulnerabilities, right? So like that information really comes from the CVEs that we saw being exploited. When you take a look, though, and this is something that I think it can't be reiterated enough, is that organizations have been patching really on two models, right? They're patching either based off of prevalence, how much of this vulnerability is in my environment, or criticality, how critical in terms of CVSS score is this vulnerability. And when you talk to a customer and they're like, well, if it's a CVSS score of 9 or higher, then it's kind of break glass, immediately patch. Everything else will schedule downtime. We'll kind of figure out when we're going to deploy that patch. The problem that we've been seeing is that a lot of these threat actors are chaining multiple vulnerabilities together. And so it kind of breaks that CVSS model, because if, we've seen vulnerabilities in the last couple of weeks being heavily exploited, and there was a series of 2 vulnerabilities. One was an initial access, unauthenticated initial access, which was, I think, a CVSS score of around 5. The other one was a local privilege escalation that was maybe it was like an 8 or so on CVSS score. And so if an organization looks at that 8 and they're like, well, it's pretty high, but it's still a local privilege escalation, you'd need to already be on the system to take advantage of that. They're completely ignoring the fact that there's an unauthenticated access that had a CVSS score of 5. So yes, in isolation, that might be less of a concern, that LPE. But when you put in concert with it that there's another vulnerability that gives them that initial access, now you've got a kill shot. And most organizations are not looking at these things, holistically, right? They're not looking across all the vulnerabilities that are out there. They're only looking at them individually, which is why, one of the things that when I talk to boards and I talk to customers, I'm always kind of advocating that they take more of an adversary approach to patching, and to take a look at what vulnerabilities are being exploited today, what products are they in, who's exploiting them, and then map that to your actual, what vertical are you in? What geos are you located in? What threat actors are targeting you? And you can really start to dial that in to have a way more effective patch management program that actually probably takes a lot of the strain off of it. As well, because there's so many vulnerabilities and patches that come out every single month, let's say, if not every single day, that it becomes really unmanageable for teams that need to do that, but also balance with that the need to be operational and to be up and running. They can't just take everything down to patch every couple of hours.
That's fascinating. I can't wait for this report to make it into the hands, of even folks here in the U.S., right? Because I can only imagine that companies that are in Latin America are also being targeted as maybe even an entry point, with respect to their relationship with U.S. companies, right? And so, or their ties even to the U.S. government in some capacity, especially with, Mexico-U.S. relations, for example, Brazil-U.S. relations. And so would you even say that there's going to be additional focus on Latin America in an effort to also gain access to, Western or really U.S.-based companies that have big relationships down there or establishments down there?
Yeah, I mean, and remember, there's also a bit of a supply chain issue. We see a lot of people offshoring to Latin America as well. There's a lot of great coders down there, and so we see a lot of tech getting offshored down there. And so that becomes part of the supply chain concern as well. So yeah, I mean, this is why I think it's important that we put this report out. It's important to raise awareness. I remember when we first started CrowdStrike and we first started launching the Intel team, and I started kind of picking and hiring analysts that we needed. And I was like, we need a LATAM analyst. And I got a lot of pushback initially because there was kind of this concept of like, well, there's no threats down there, right? And now, 12 years later or so, it's very clear that this is a incredibly connected part of the global ecosystem, and it's one that is being heavily targeted by these threat actors. And we also see threat actors emerging out of Latin America too. So that I don't want to miss that, because we see like Plump Spider, and we see lots of other things emerging out of that region that are Blind Spider, etc., that are focused on LATAM, coming out of LATAM. And so this is, when you think of an emerging market, this is truly emerging on both sides, in that they're really starting to take cybersecurity seriously in Latin America, but they also are quickly finding lots of threats. So it's, I think, perfect timing for us to get this report out, to raise awareness, and to time that with, we've got Crowd Tour in Brazil and a couple of other places kicking off in the next week or so. Because I think for them too, it's the opposite of here, in terms of, it's, as I was saying, that a lot of people might think, there's really no concern about Latin America from a cyber threat perspective. I think down there, they may now first be kind of coming to grips with the fact that they do have a cybersecurity challenge, and they need to take it seriously. We're starting to see that there's government action. They're building these agencies, as I said. They're establishing multilateral and bilateral agreements to deal with cyber threat issues. And so as that occurs, I think they're quickly realizing that they can't keep running the 1990s antivirus and expect that that's just going to keep them safe.
Any guidance then for those companies in the LATAM region?
As we said, the adversaries have been moving off EDR. So first of all, get that EDR in place. Make sure you're doing kind of that's kind of table stakes at this point, having endpoint detection and response in place. Mentioned 1 billion records that we saw. So there's clearly identity issues down there. So get that identity threat detection and response in place as well. And then, one of the things that we announced at RSA was that we have Overwatch threat hunting for next-gen SIEM. And when you think about those initial access vulnerabilities, they're largely targeting unmanaged devices. They're going after the firewalls, the VPN concentrators, the routers and switching infrastructure. So one of the ways that you can combat that is to take the telemetry from those things, bring it into next-gen SIEM, and then overlay that on top of your EDR data to get a sense of how are they getting in and where are they going. And then having that Overwatch threat hunting on top of that, we're already finding a whole bunch of different threats with that third-party data. So that is yet another thing that everybody should be thinking about down there. So you get your identities under control, you get your vulnerability exposures under control, and you have that threat hunting so that the humans can find these other humans. That it takes a human to catch a human.
Yeah.
And so that is another kind of area that you can kind of quickly ramp up on. And I think also just awareness, making sure that you're consuming intelligence, getting information, read the LATAM threat report for sure, and follow along with the Adversary Universe podcast.
That's right. Gracias por escuchar al Adversary Universe podcast. Me llamo Cristian Rodriguez. Y mi amigo Adam Myers. Yeah. And thank you so much for listening to the Adversary Universe podcast. This is fascinating. I can't wait for the report to get into the hands of our listeners, our
I'm about to hit
customers.
send.
You're about to hit send, and there's a whole lot more that's coming out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Adam and myself. A lot more coming. Some pretty great guests actually coming up in the next couple of episodes. And so we're going to have some really great content to cover. Yeah.
And I'll tease it out. The next regional report we're going to have coming out and will go public will be the Asia Pacific region.
Oh, I can't wait for that one.
Look forward to that.
We'll
Yeah.
definitely have some guests from those regions kind of giving some feedback as well. Can't wait for the LATAM threat report. A lot of really great info on eCrime and nation state activity. Yeah, and then we'll have some guests for the next few episodes. So looking forward to
Perfect.
it. Awesome.
All right. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Thank you so much for listening. See you in the next one.
Adios.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode. If you like what you're hearing, subscribe to our podcast and head over to crowdstrike.com/adversaries to learn more about the many bad guys we track. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on the Adversary Universe podcast.